Welcome to Dedicated. I'm your host, Doug Brunt. Today we're talking with Gregg Hurwitz. He is the New York Times #1 best-selling author of 24 books. He's also a screenwriter, a comic book writer. He's done work on Batman for DC Comics and Wolverine for Marvel. He also serves as co-president of International Thriller Writers. His latest is the 9th book in the very popular and awesome Orphan X series called Lone Wolf. Gregg, it's great to be with you.
Thanks for having me on. It's good to be here.
We are lucky to grab you on Thriller Fest week. So you're in town to, I guess, as co-president of International Thriller Writers, you're probably putting on a big event this week.
It's so fun. Yeah, we have Dennis Lehane's in for one of our Thriller Masters. We have Tess Garrett's in. I'll be interviewing Dennis. He's one of my favorites, and Tess and I go back forever, and we got panels, and it's a great event here. It's a little more industry-facing because we're in New York, and so we have agents come in and publishers, and we've started a lot of careers. So it's a very cool way for those of us who came up in the pre-internet era to have a lot more kind of connection and move people along. It's a very supportive organization.
Oh, that's cool. Well, you picked the gin and tonic, and I'll tell you a quick Dennis Lehane story as I make our gin and tonics here, which, by the way, good drink choice. It's kind of a warm, sunny day, so it's
a good midday drink.
Yeah, we're not going to crush ourselves this early. But I was at a book festival out in California, and I interviewed Dennis for one of the segments, and we were at the dinner afterward, and they had this long buffet table, and at the end of the buffet table was this pool that began abruptly. So the next step after the end of the table was the deep end of the pool, which I didn't see. And we'd already had a couple of drinks, and Lehane, thank goodness for me, was right behind me because I had my foot hovered over the deep end. I was about to plunge in. He grabbed me by the shirt collar and pulled me back.
Really?
A lesser man would have shoved me.
Yeah. Can I grab a little more ice while we're doing this?
Sure. We are actually out of the ice on that cup.
That's okay.
That was the extent of our ice.
That's all right then. Here we go.
Thank you for the assist. You are the first to assist with the bartending. I appreciate that.
Well, it's a working interview, Doug.
That's right. You gotta sing for your supper. Cheers.
Cheers.
Great to meet you.
It's great to meet you too. Oh my goodness.
Oh, that tastes good. I haven't had a gin and tonic forever. For
I
some
love
reason,
gin
I
and
haven't been doing
tonics.
those.
There's great South African gins that are, they're not floral, but they have all the botanicals. Like gins are great. Gins are like a whole language. And I didn't know that gin is originally from Holland, not from England. We think of them as so British. Yeah. And so there's some great ones I talk about it a little bit in Lone Wolf.
It's in the book. And you also identify rum as a substandard spirit.
Yes. I like, rum's great if you're on a tropical vacation, but let's be honest here. It's just us and no one else listening.
No, you were talking my language in the book. I love those passages on it. And I just saw some article on gin. I like Hendrick's. And for a while, I was on a kick with Plymouth gin.
Plymouth is naval strength.
Yeah. And
you know why it's naval strength?
No.
Because it's actually, the proof is high enough that it can ignite. And so the British Navy used to never leave port without it. So if they ran out of gunpowder, they could substitute the gin. That's very British.
Wow.
So that's the naval strength version of Plymouth. And that's the base gin. Usually when you go to Duke's, the world's greatest martini is Duke's in London. And there's a guy there, Alessandro, who's like the master martini bartender. He's the only one allowed to pour the vermouth and flick it on the carpet. Everybody else has to pour it on the tray. And they bring the Plymouth out. It's freezing cold. And they have their very own vermouth. And I said to him, is it true that this vermouth, I had read this, is only here and at Buckingham Palace? And I was told, sir, if the Queen wants a Duke's martini, the Queen comes to Duke's.
Wow.
So they are very, very serious about their martinis.
I've got to go to this place.
It's phenomenal, man.
It's called the Dukes.
It's the big pour, and they have the sprig, and everything comes out just frozen. It pours like syrup. It's an amazing place. There's a 2 martini limit, but I will tell you how you get around that is after you have 2 martinis, you can order like a Vesper that's like their version of a Cosmo. So you can continue drinking. They just won't serve you 3 because they're so strong.
Wow. I know, I try to stop at 1. My new policy is 1 of either a Manhattan or a martini, and then I've got to downshift to wine. Otherwise, the next day.
Right?
Yeah, I'm just like, I don't think I'm metabolizing the way I did when I was a younger man.
You remember? Yeah, that's true. Remember Dorothy Parker's line about martinis?
No.
She said, 1 martini, I'm under the influence. 2 martinis, I'm under the table. 3 martinis, I'm under the host.
I like that.
She was something, man.
Yeah. All right, so let's begin at the beginning with Gregg Hurwitz. You were born and I think raised in San Francisco?
Born in San Francisco. I was raised in the Bay Area, a little bit south, Silicon Valley before it was Silicon Valley.
Yeah.
I guess it always was Silicon Valley, but you know.
I don't know. When did that come in? I remember like there was an early James
Pre.com.
Bond movie that had, chips being made. The one with Grace Jones.
It was back in early days. It was like everyone's dad was an engineer. It was like super like white. Everybody looked like the NASA launch. Like the dads had the glasses and the pocket protectors. It was very like Hewlett Packard.
Yes.
Old school.
Yeah.
And then with .com, it's sort of like the whole world came in, right? And everything.
I got there right before that. I moved right after college. I moved to San Francisco in 1993, and I lived in the Upper Haight. In this sort of dumpy apartment with a couple of roommates. We were a couple blocks away from where the Grateful Dead house was. Remember all that?
And what were you doing there?
I mean, we moved out there without jobs. We met some girl who worked for a temp agency, so she would temp us out to something for a few hours each week, and I was bartending before I moved there, so I had some cash savings to spend.
How great, man. Where'd you do college?
Duke.
Oh, okay. That's a big change.
Yeah.
From Duke to the Haight, man.
And it was so great. It just had such a good
San Francisco
feel.
It's a wild town.
We were actually there when Jerry Garcia died in 95, I guess it was.
Wow.
And, everyone was around there lighting about 1,000 candles around that house where the Dead had lived.
That's a wild place.
Yeah. And then the .com, as you say, came in.
Yeah, and then everything blew open. It became like very international and everything kind of opened up, and it's a very different vibe now.
Yeah.
But growing up there was very kind of suburban. It was a great place to grow up.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So then you went East Coast for Harvard undergrad, the big brain.
I did. Back when that was still something to be proud of. I studied English and psychology.
Yeah.
I started my first novel. I was 19. All I wanted to do was be a novelist.
So as an undergrad, you were writing a novel. Okay.
I mean, I have mysteries I illustrated with crayons when I was in 5th grade. I mean, like I only wanted to be a novelist.
Wow.
And so I studied English and psych. I loved it. My thesis advisor on the psych side was Jordan Peterson.
I wanted to ask you about that. I read so you were studying under a young Jordan Peterson. He's only like 10 years old.
And on the literary side, Marjorie Garber, who's a wonderful Shakespearean scholar and just incredible. It was amazing. It was an amazing time. Seamus Heaney was there teaching like Irish poetry. I mean, it was just like it was a halcyon era. And I was furiously I was writing this really shitty rough draft of my first novel the summer before and after senior year. I started some of it summer after junior year. And then I kind of did a stall and went, because, all my roommates were graduating, going off to med school and law school and iBanking and making, it felt like $11 billion.
Yeah.
And I just wanted to be a novelist. And so I applied for fellowships. I was very fortunate. I won a fellowship to go get a master's in England.
Oxford.
Yeah.
Trinity College at Oxford.
Yeah. Shakespearean tragedy, because I needed a highly practical degree to enter the job force if my career as a novelist didn't work out. I'm incredibly employable. And I just did this kind of stall. I went there. I did Jungian and Freudian analysis of Shakespearean tragedy. That was still porting that over. I did a lot of stuff on Othello, but I was really finishing and furiously rewriting that same
novel from
It's called
19.
The Tower.
Yeah, which came out. I remember it came out in '99. So you worked on that even a little after the Masters.
That's right. It took some doing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So are you still in touch with Jordan Peterson from the Harvard days?
Yeah, we're quite close still.
Yeah. What has that relationship been like? Because he's, when you were studying under him, he was not a known guy. He hadn't published a book yet. Now he's this huge global.
It's so funny.
figure.
When I started Orphan X, he had done. You remember Quora? I want to say it was an online thing. I hope I'm saying that right. But there was an online like post board, and he'd posted these kind of rules for life. And I thought they were kind of brilliant. Jordan like officiated my wedding. We go back forever.
Oh, wow.
And so I put, Orphan X, my assassin in these books, has the 10 assassin's commandments that he lives his life by. But there's a single mother who lives downstairs from him. She's a district attorney, and she has this boy who she's raising who Evan feels very connected with. Evan grew up in an orphanage, in a foster home in East Baltimore, and was kind of taken out at the age of 12 and trained up to be this assassin. And so this young man being raised downstairs from him, this kid, I wanted him to have a set of rules that are more geared towards a healthy lifestyle than 10 Assassin's Commandments, which was Evan's upbringing. So I put these rules. I'm like, this is from my, uncontroversial psychology professor. He was then at U Toronto. Like, this should be easy. So his rules for life are in the first books. And then, of course, he exploded, and it was pretty funny. But, I'm sort of center left. Jordan's politics are center right. And we've done a lot of kind of across the aisle work. And we've been kind of beneficial adversaries in our engagement with each other, but we have so much overlap with stuff that we agree on. Yeah. But we've brought in different communities, into some kind of resonance. But it's really funny that, and so I 12 Rules for Life. I helped him when he was working on and editing that, and we've just been kind of in each other's work a lot. So it's pretty. That's funny.
Great. Is he one of the early readers of your books?
Not an early reader, but I sent him, I dedicated my 1, 2, 3, 4, 6th or 7th book to him, way back when. So no, I send them when they're done.
Yeah, because the first, we'll get to some of this. This is in my notes for later on, but the first Orphan X, I think, came out in 2016. Yeah. Which is probably just before he exploded. When did his book 12 Rules come out? It was right in that 16 to 18 range, I think.
Yeah, I don't know anything. Yeah. It could be 1937. I'm terrible with dates. But no, it was before all that. And then it's funny because it was this big conversation piece for some people, or a lot of readers came in a way that it just wasn't supposed. It was supposed to be this obscure reference to my, brilliant psych professor. Yeah. But yeah, so it's the only thing I wanted to do. And it's funny because people talk about Shakespearean tragedy. They're like, why would you, be a Shakespearean scholar and write thrillers? And it's like, well, first of all, I was Shakespearean dilettante, right? It was a 1-year master's. I loved it. But the thing is, what was Shakespeare doing? They're highly structured, highly plot-driven narratives around lust, intrigue, and murder. Many of them based on and reinventing former tropes and plots, right? So a lot of the, histories are incorporated. Merchant of Venice came from the Jew of Malta. The only fully original thing he did was The Tempest, his goodbye, the stage. Everything else has a basis. So you think about, Chandler and Hammett, and then they're reinterpreted by, Robert B. Parker, and then Robert Crace and Sue Grafton and Mike Connolly interpret. We're constantly, Lehane, who's brilliant. He's one of our thriller masters this year, which I mentioned at ITW. And so there's this reinterpretation of themes around a very structured, narrative-driven, plot-forward kind of narrative that's designed. Shakespeare was trying to put asses in chairs at the Globe Theater. Yeah. He's trying to sell out to everybody. He'll make a fleeting reference to Ovid's Metamorphosis for the royalty, and then he'll make a dick joke for the groundlings. So he's trying to kind of get everybody. Yeah. It was a commercial venture.
And your book is also, it has fully formed characters who are making these very wise observations of human nature. And I mean, it's a really terrific book. Your character, Evan Smoak, he's a father figure. He's a friend. He's all of these things, and you have great relationships that are driving the plot forward as well. It's not just twisty turny, murder
Thank
stuff.
you. I think character is everything, man. It's why we tune in. It's why we care. If you don't have character, we've all been to those movies where you just feel like you're getting punched in the face with action, with that never-ending third act. The character has to be at the center. And, we know this intuitively. If I asked you what your favorite James Bond action scene is, you'd probably think for a minute, but everybody knows how he takes his martini. Right. So it's spending time with a character, and Evan is evolving immensely. This is the 9th book. I think of the series in a lot of ways. I started it when I was on the cusp of turning 40, and I feel like I was having all the rules that had governed the first part of my life, or all the stories, I felt like were insufficient to just do over again for what I hope is the second half of my life. And there's this period in the middle where you're reconstituting in some ways one's view of oneself. That happens. And so literally I started the series Orphan X when Evan, he's left the assassin program. He's gone out on his own. He's sort of like a pro bono assassin. He helps people in desperate need. They call an encrypted number. It's 1-855-2-nowhere. And you can call it and you can see who answers in real life.
Oh, I got to try that.
Yeah.
I should have done that when I read it.
Seriously, that should have been part of your prep. But, he basically, the first book, he breaks all 10 of the Assassin's Commandments he was raised with. And it's the process of him thawing into trying to understand what it means to be human. And one of the things his father figure and handler from the CIA told him when he took him at 12 is he says, the hard part won't be turning you into a killer. The hard part is keeping you human.
Right.
And the series for me, in some ways, I feel like Orphan X starts and he almost realizes he's this sort of archetypal thriller hero. He's like a Reacher or Bourne, but he wants to be more. He never learned to speak the strange language of intimacy.
It's interesting. I had one observation I want to share with you now, and then we'll get more into your book and Evan later. But when I was reading him, he's not the biggest, he's not the fastest or the strongest, but he is the most prepared. And so as I was reading the book, I was thinking of him as sort of the Tom Brady of the genre, who's not really the most athletic QB out there, but
I say
nobody outprepares him.
He's like Ulysses too. He's the man of many wiles. Like Ulysses isn't the best archer. He's not the best fighter. He's like but he's 2 or 3 in every category. And he has to bring the totality of who he is with all these different experts in to sort of navigate through the complexities to some outcome that is both, I hope, satisfying for genre readers, but also that there's some sort of moral victory.
Yeah.
And, like I said, the series really is, it's almost like it begins when he realizes he's Pinocchio, but he wants to be a real boy. And so he's driving towards becoming a human. And it's a story about somebody trying to 3-dimensionalize himself, how he views others in the world. And it just happens to be wrapped in a thriller franchise.
Yeah. It's amazing. And I love his relationships with the other main characters who sort of stay with him book to book. But a quick deviation on that. Before we get to Orphan X, it looked like most of your comic book writing was in the 07, 09 range.
Yeah, until I did some creator-owned work more recently, but yes.
Okay. And you did both the DC and the Marvel universe.
I did.
Why do you think in film it seems Marvel has been more successful, at least in recent decades? I remember Saturday morning cartoons, it was the Hall of Justice and more DC, and Marvel it was barely I think Spider-Man was out there, I guess, but it wasn't as much of a thing. Why have they had so much more success in film?
I think Kevin Feige is an incredible studio head. I think he had in mind very much a big picture, a big narrative. I think he's a visionary, and I think he guided it well. I think that the Nolan and Goyer started these. David Goyer, who's a fantastic screenwriter, comic book writer too. The Batman stuff, the Dark Knight stuff, I think was exceptional. I think it's as good as anything. But I think that Marvel has had much more of a vision of the whole universe and much more of a plan. And, man with a plan beats a man without a plan.
Yeah. And it seems like DC's trying to get the universe going, although there have been some fits and starts with that, and they haven't really achieved anything near what
it's hard to run a, multi-billion-dollar franchise. And Feige's great. Marvel's, the film side's very lined out.
Yeah.
It's interesting. There's some differences between Marvel and DC that I think lend themselves to adaptations in different ways, but I think that might be too far down
the characters,
like the nerd rabbit hole. Well, yeah, I think so in some ways. There's differences. I think Marvel is more immediately and humanly psychological. It's like, who's the Hulk, right? He's somebody who loses his temper and then is out of control. Spider-Man was the first character who's like in the real world where you and I live. Like he tears his suit and he has to stitch it up, and Aunt May notices, and he's upstairs in his room and he gets bullied. There's a lot of sort of deep, immediate humanity to those characters. And I think in some ways DC starts off a bit more abstract. Like my favorite character is Batman. So I have to, this isn't a bias issue. I'm observing differences, but Superman is pretty, exceptional, in all ways. There's the break, and
plus he's an alien to begin with. I mean, he's not even an
What's interesting about Superman to think about, who's invented a lot of these characters there's a real renaissance in Jewish and Italian creators around comics, like huge contributions. What's interesting with Superman, who's invented, created by two Jews from Cleveland, is he's the only superhero that his alias is actually that he's normal. So he's passing because he's really an alien, right? Like Bruce Banner is Bruce Banner, and then his alter identity is the Hulk, and Peter Parker's alternate identity is Spider-Man. Superman really is an alien, but he's trying to kind of pass.
That's
and so there's this very
it flips it.
cultural overlay of like the kind of grateful, loving immigrant who wants to do more to protect and hold up and contribute to the culture that accepted him. So that's kind of interesting. But I love Batman. I mean, there's a lot I love about Batman, but the main thing is I think he represents the pinnacle of what humanity can do. So, you know, there's no intimacy. There's a balance between perfection and intimacy that I play with a lot in the Orphan X books. And Batman is perfect. Like he doesn't have a magic ring like Green Lantern. He can't fly, but his discipline's exceptional. Even spiritually, you know, he goes to Tibet and learns the ways of the ancient masters. Technology, of course, he's incredible, but he's just a human who represents the height of it. But because of that, he can't have anyone in his life. His parents are killed. Robin's always getting killed. There's a new Robin. New Robin gets killed. And so there's this isolation.
Yeah.
And so writing it for me, in a lot of ways, my interest in...
He's the most unhappy of the superheroes.
He is. He's very gloomy and moody and angsty and teenagery. But I think that's part of why when I was writing Orphan X, I thought, well, what would it be like, you know, I took some of my favorite characters, meaning, you know, Peter Parker is engaging in the real world. One of the things Evan does is he's in the real world. You don't see Reacher go home or Bourne have an awkward encounter at the mail slots with, you know, a single mom who he has awkward tension with. And so I really wanted Evan to be moving between these sort of archetypal thriller worlds and then the real world where he comes home bleeding from a knife cut and gets pulled into like an annoying as hell HOA meeting that they're debating whether they can have kombucha.
Or getting grief from this teenage girl who sort of helps him out a little bit. But then he's also sort of an older brother, father figure as well to that person.
Yeah.
So.
And unlike Batman, who has to forever be alone to maintain his Batman-ness, Evan's trying to move into what it means to be and live among people, even if he himself can never be normal. It's like he's got his face up to the aquarium glass and he can't live a life that other people have, but he can be the wolf who hunts wolves to protect them, right, when their life is being threatened, even if it's a life he can't have.
That's awesome. We always do a process section because all of that sounds amazing. I want to hear how you sort of put pen to paper around it and plan it. But before we do that, I want to ask you briefly about International Thriller Writers, where you are serving as co-president.
With Lisa Unger.
I was just going to say, who is it, and why not absolute power? Why is there a co-president?
I've tried, man. I had an alternate electoral slate. I tried to push her out. I had a hostile takeover. She's too crafty. We always have two presidents. It's an interesting question.
There always has been?
Yeah. I came in with Heather Graham, who's a wonderful writer. I think there always has been. I'm not sure. Lee was the president before I was there, but when I came in, we've always had it balanced, and it's really nice to have. Do you have different roles, or you sort of combine around? We combine everything. Role? We have different strengths. You know, like I was all about doing a bunch of AI. We did a bunch of research and polling around AI a couple of years ago when that was starting to hit. You know, and so we have different projects that we can use and put forward. You know, we spun. I have a friend who runs. Who helps with an all-girls school. I think they went co-ed now that Oprah helped start in Nigeria. And so for one of our projects a few years ago, we just raised money and built them a library at this girls' school. Because he came over and I just gave him signed books. And then he sends me this beautiful email with these like beautiful young women being like, I love the books. Like our only problem is we don't get enough books. And so we're able to just send an email out to our whole crew and be like, everyone donate books. You know, we'll donate money. We'll do a raise. I know the guy on the ground in Nigeria. He built this library. We filled it with books. It's the biggest library in the region. It's bigger than the colleges or universities. And so...
And that all came from your organization?
Yeah, it came from ITW. It was our first library. And so we just, you know, we get to do these cool kind of projects. And then a lot of what we do is support for younger writers. And I didn't have that, man. I mean, I was very young and very fortunate to sell my first book. But I still remember the first time they were like, well, you need blurbs from novelists. I'm like, I've never met a novelist. Like, I don't know. How do you get a blurb from novelists? I mean, it was... Yeah. It was so removed.
Is there sort of a mentoring component to what you're doing?
Yeah. Like, if you come to Thriller Fest, you'll meet agents, you'll meet writers. There's a lot of time at the bar because writers all drink. I mean, not that you know anything about that. You know, but we have courses, we have craft stuff. There's a lot of ways to plug in. And we have a lot of great success stories. People who met an agent here, editors. There's a lot of people that we've kind of supported and brought up because, you know, our philosophy is... reading is good. A rising tide lifts all boats.
Yeah. Yeah.
The more we can, you know, it's the more we have a J.K. Rowling or a Lee Child or a Harlan or a, like these events that sweep in, the more we celebrate it, it's people in bookstores, man. And if people are reading Mike Connolly or Walter Mosley, it's like the more they're in bookstores and they're just buying stuff.
I totally agree. And every talented writer and great writer I've ever met has always been someone who reaches a hand back to help the next person up. And has that same mentality of rising tide lifts all boats. That it's not some zero. If they sell a book, that's one less sale for me. That's never the thought.
I might be biased, but I do think we're nicer and more generous in the crime writing community
than like other genre than the romance novelists.
Well, romance novelists are pretty great. Let's just say genre. I think we have so much like exorcising of our shadow on the page that when it comes to real life, everyone's pretty great. Like there's not a lot of literary feuds in the. We don't do that stuff. And look, it's also cultural. Like when I was coming up, like you won't meet a nicer human than Michael Connolly. You won't meet a smarter, cooler, more generous soul than Lee Child, who you know quite well. These are great people. Yeah. Sue Grafton was good to me early. You've interviewed Patricia Cornwell. Like people are really helpful, and that sets a certain template. And there's a certain standard to hold up to. You need blurbs. You need, people would interview me. Robert Crace did events with me. He'd come over and interview. We'd film something in my living room when I'm starting out. And then you start to recognize that to find, all you want is to find people who are great. And so there's these young writers coming up, and if they're great, you just want to have them be introduced to the world. You want to help them like we were helped. Yeah. Because you need help. I mean, it's a solitary venture in certain ways, and then there's an immense amount of teamwork with publishers and marketing and the ecosystem.
Yeah. One other question on your organization there, you mentioned you did some research on AI. And I assume you're trying to figure out ways to help thriller writers navigate AI and what kind of a threat it really poses. And we had Scott Brick on the show, who's a great audiobook reader. You
Scott's
probably
my
know.
guy.
Has he done your book?
Scott is the voice of Orphan X.
He's awesome.
I'm seeing Scott for a drink tonight. If you call 1-855 to nowhere,
no way,
you might hear Scott Brick.
All right. So he was great. He was a great guest, and he was so he read my Diesel book, and he's just a terrific guy.
Oh, he did? He was the narrator?
He was the narrator for Diesel. Yeah. And of course, that helped my audio
I can't wait to look at that. Yeah, Scott's got bigger.
He has a whole following. Like all these people can't.
Scott will come to my event, my launch event in LA. We're very close. He's done my last 60 novels, but he'll come to my event in LA. And so now we usually do it where we just talk together, but he used to sit in the crowd and he'd talk, and I'd see all these people turning around, like women getting
I know
flushed.
That voice.
And, yeah. He's just, it's amazing having him there. And then I feel like I don't want to go up and read in front of Scott Brick.
Yeah. And he's another Shakespeare guy too, right?
Yeah. He's amazing.
But the reason I raised that is the audiobook narration is under threat from AI, along with many things. But they could get a voice that sounds kind of like Scott Brick and have that just insert text, and out comes this great voice reading the book. What do you see as a threats for the writers of these books, people like you and Harlan and others?
Well, I think rather than we're in a time of massively accelerating cultural and social change. Right. And we like stability. And I think we look at the unknown and we tend to feel we're more associated with the threat of the unknown than the opportunity of the unknown. But it's both. And we have to sort of view it as an adventure, and we have to get used to kind of surfing. And so I think one thing I'd like to talk about are some of the advantages I think that human authors have over AI. The biggest thing is where it is in our value structure, meaning AI is great if we're in charge of AI. Meaning we want to be Sorcerer Mickey. We don't want to be the eyeless mops hauling buckets of water, right? And so I use AI as a research assistant for me. If I'm writing a scene, I'm like, what's the weather like in Maine in February? Yeah. What are the bugs around a pond? You have to double check it because it'll sometimes go off on its own and play tricks on you. But, I used to have, I was writing a torture scene, of course, because I write thrillers, that dealt with a deli meat slicer. And so I was like, what's the toggle called that you turn it on? Normally I'd have to go on a bunch of websites. I'd have to download the pamphlet in a PDF and go through it and find it. There's all these shortcuts and ways to get to different things quicker. Yeah. Now, the advantages that people have is in our polling, 97% of the readers we polled do not want to read a book by a dead author that's AI generated. So transparency is really key. If you're doing any actual writing,
but if you did a blind taste test, like I should do this soon, and I will, just to read an AI generated book. Like, give me a great thriller, you know, along the lines of a Reacher novel, and just spit something out in 5 minutes, and I'll read it and see if it's any good. Have you read anything like that?
Yeah, it's terrible.
It's not good.
It's not good.
Okay.
So I have a good friend. His name's Jim Keller. I think he's the preeminent computer chip designer in the world. He did the chip for the iPhone for Steve Jobs. He ran the self-driving division for Tesla. And Jim's he's a super genius, but he was super confident about this. We had these conversations, and he's brutal too. He's just like a savage. He's also a stunt pilot. And so he's just really funny. But I was like, well, what about like the human? Because he's like, we're going to have all that done. He's building the chip now that will underlie a lot of AI. He's like, we can have Faulkner novels. Like, you can push a button and get it.
Get a brand new one.
Yeah, I'm like, but what about like the human spark? He's like, sure, if you believe in magic. Like, we had all these funny fights. And then he came back and was like, look, it's harder. It's not quite as easy as we think it is. So like, our conversations have changed.
How much time elapsed between those two conversations?
3-6 months, maybe. But look, he's got a point. If you think you're super special, look, we think about automation coming for jobs that are blue collar working class, and it's like they can just come for everybody. Yeah. Paralegals, there's whole departments in academia that are going to be defunct. Mm-hmm. But for me, it still hasn't reached that yet. But there's two other things that I think are important to highlight. Let's say it could get to mediocre. It can't understand the arc of a writer's career, all our vulnerabilities, all the times you run into hardship. Where do we learn when something's awful? When your wife gets ill, when you struggle with a kid, when you lose someone you love, like all of our kind of grief and unpredictability that leads to wisdom or depth or psychological awareness. I don't think that can be emulated over a longer arc with AI. So the first thing is transparency. People don't want it. They don't want to be fooled by it. So we should honor that, because you should honor what, it's like people want to know what's in their food. People want to know what's in their reading material. Mm-hmm. The second thing I'll say, it's very important around AI, is human excellence. That's what turns us on. That's what inspires us. It's like I don't want to, when Deep Blue first came along, we weren't watching Deep Blue play itself in a simulated chess match. We wanted to see how Kasparov could fare against the computer. I don't want to watch an AI basketball game. I want to watch Michael Jordan soar, right? We don't watch the Olympics. I could generate an AI I was a pole vaulter in college, so I was good at pole vaulting, right? And you want the risk of a pole breaking. You want to see Sergei Bubka or Mondo Duplat. Like, there's these great vaulters. You want to see humans doing things that are human and excellent. Mm-hmm. And the last thing I'll say, and in some ways this is the most important, is community. And what I mean by community is, let's say I can push a button, and we can do this soon. Let's talk about that Faulkner novel. I want a Faulkner novel. I want it half the length. I don't like violence against kids. My IQ is 115, let's say, so dial the vocab to my IQ, and I want inside jokes pulled from my Instagram in the style of Friends for the dialogue. Like, boop, there you go. Here's your Faulkner hybrid chip. Mm-hmm. And on the one hand, it sounds amazing to have this bespoke thing, but on the other hand, it's actually like a definition of hell in some ways, in that everything is unique to you. Mm-hmm. And so we're going to be like WALL-E, where the Pixar movie, we're floating around being fed this content just for ourselves. And what's very interesting, I talked to you about some of my peregrinations through different communities, which I like to do. And I've had a lot of overlap with different like theologians and religious thinkers. And what's very interesting is if you look at AI through that lens, it matches in some ways an evangelical description of hell. Like C.S. Lewis's book, The Great Divorce, is amazing, where man is separate from God and separate from each other. Mm-hmm. And that's AI. It's like this version of AI is, you have your own bespoke, everything's just tailored only for you. It's exactly what you think you want, but there's no shared narrative with other people, and there's no overarching narrative that connects you. Yeah. And so I think it leads to more atomization. There's not as much meaning. Going to movies is like going to temple or to church, right? It's a shared experience. There's oxytocin release when everybody laughs in a movie theater, and people want that. That's why we have 1,000 people this week at Thriller Fest. Yeah. And AI can't your bespoke thing, it also reminds me of the reason I still get the paper delivered and sort through a paper physical newspaper, because there's this voyage of discovery. I don't get the exact news I want tailored. I turn the page and I
discover something, the sort of random discovery of the articles I wasn't expecting, I wasn't searching for, but I come upon and is interesting and takes me somewhere new. Now, I'm still in the universe of the Wall Street Journal and the New York Times and the New York Post, but I come across items that I wouldn't have otherwise come across if I were customizing my news feed just for me.
That's right. And that's part of, I mean, this is a much bigger diagnosis we're making, but that's going through bookstores, man. I mean, I remember walking through a bookstore and like coming upon, it's like, what's this book? It was like Race Matters by Cornel West in 1995 or something. I'm like, what's this? Like, just read some book by a thinker. I knew Cornel West was a professor. I was an undergrad. Stuff that's, you know, that's not my political inclination, but why not read him? Like, I picked that up, get a book by you know, Skip Gates. Like, here's a weird cover for a literary book. Here's a poetry book. Like, our movement through a bookstore is very different than algorithmically targeting, which is, oh, you like Orphan X? You should read The Gray Man, and you should read Lee Child, and you should, like, it just moves you down into more of the same. And we see that with a lot of our news siloing also right now, right? It's like, oh, you hate Republicans? Here you go. Oh, you hate Democrats? Here you go. And we're in these different arenas. And so I think we have a craving for rebuilding community in ways that allows for more nuance, allows for the introduction of more ideas.
Yeah, nuance. We need that. Okay, so let's get into process briefly, because I'm always fascinated. By the way, I'm going to hold the book up again. This was such a terrific read. It was actually my first experience with your book. So you can, even though Evan is evolving in the way, you know, James Reese by our buddy Jack Carr is also evolving book to book, but you can enter anywhere.
Yeah.
So I love the book. But in terms of your process, I'm always fascinated with people who write suspense and twisty books. If you outline it up front, or if you're just sort of in it and it's happening and you're writing in real time, or like Lee Child doesn't outline. He just says, it's better for me if even I don't know what's going to happen on the next page.
There's a great book by Andy Martin called Reacher Said Nothing, which I think you know, that's about, he stayed with Lee for a year when Lee was writing a book and wrote a book about Lee writing a book.
I don't know this book.
It's really fun. So everyone should check that out, because it's a wonderful piece, and it's fun to spend time with Lee any way you can spend time with Lee, you know? So I have what I call a rolling outline. It's kind of weird. I have a big flat screen TV mounted to my desk. That's my monitor. And I have two, before I start writing, I have usually 15 to 25 pages of just bullet points, and they're it's snippets of dialogue, it's scenes, it's character stuff, it's plot points, it's reveals. I roughly shape them into some kind of order, but they're clay, and it's a living, breathing outline, which is why I call it a rolling outline. And as I'm writing the book and discovering more things from the book, the outline, first it bloats. It always bloats where I go, oh my God, it's going to be a 600-page book. And then it starts to shrink and get subsumed into the manuscript. And when I'm done, I have a 400-page manuscript here, and then this Word doc's empty, and I just trash it.
Yeah.
But it's moving the whole time. And so if I have a scene, I'm like, oh, wait a minute, this will be great. I can drop a handkerchief here. I'll refer to it in the second act. I can pay it off in the third act. And so it's not that I have a rigid thing that I'm fulfilling because I need to be on the cutting edge of it, but I have sort of holds across. I think of it like, have you ever seen those indoor rock climbing walls? It's like that, where I'm like, oh, I have this big chunky scene in the middle of the second act. I might get there with my left foot or my right hand, but I know it's there. I know I can get across the wall. And then I start to write, and I kind of chart the course, and things can change and evolve as I go.
Now, so the first Orphan X came out in 2016, and you've been basically on a pretty regular one-a-year clip since that time. So do you get to sort of January and you're like, oh my God, I've got, 400 bullet points here and only 30 pages here. Like I'm off schedule, or how do you sort of organize your time over the course of the year?
I tend to be just way ahead of schedule, because that allows me to have more fun and flexibility. So if a movie comes up, I can, go show up if it's on production. I do other sort of pro bono, insertions, let's just say, into the cultural conversation, trying to work against polarization, which I think is increasingly a problem, some of which we're discussing here.
That's some of the stuff you're doing with Jordan and
or with, just tackling different topics in a way that's around ending a sort of authorizing environment for increased violence and polarization to get us back together on one page. And I approach that from the position of being a very moderate, very, very moderate liberal. I always think that a proper liberal's handshake distance across the aisle from a conservative. And like, that's a good space for us to try and hold, you know, to reassert kind of core values. But yeah, so I can, you know, but I tend to be way out ahead of schedule. So I'm never.
So then how about editing? Do you get to the end and go back, or are you editing as you go?
I edit as I go a lot. And then I do a read through, and I have great editors. I'm with Keith Kayla in
you're at St. Martin's, right?
Minotaur, yeah. St. Martin's Macmillan here. I'm with Roland White, Penguin Random House in the UK. I have a wonderful agent. Like, I have a great group. So once those
are your early readers?
Yeah, I have subject matter experts. I have Tommy Stojak is a main character in this book. He's a handlebar mustache, savage, you know, armorer, sniper, amazing character. And he's very, very loosely based on a close friend of mine who's amazing, who passed away early, like UDT diver. Like those early plank holders in SEAL Team 6 would have really known him, like old school, you know, New Marcinko, that whole thing. And he's, you know, I'd go visit him. I'd shoot every gun Evan gets on. He'd be like, you want to go play adult lawn darts in the desert? We'd go out and, you know, he's in Vegas. We'd shoot rocket propelled grenade. Like, he was great. He passed away. I got another guy now who's amazing. Like, he's a expert in every kind of projectile, guns, rifles, long shot, everything. I have hackers. This one's with AI, so I relied very heavily on this. Lone Wolf has a theme that deals with AI with Jim Keller, who I mentioned before, who's just brilliant and a very deep philosophical thinker also. And so I kind of go to early people, right, to get the hacker part right, the weapons part right, you know, depending where I need to reach. Yeah. And, you know, I do my own read, and then it goes to my team, and that's my editors, my agent. I have an unimprovable agent. And so I have kind of like a core crew, and we can move it through.
Well, that's great. How about the thought of, you hinted at this earlier, that you think of Evan sort of in the bigger picture and his overall character development, but do you sit down with each of these books and think ahead, you know, 10 books, where is he going to be, and how do you handle that in this book to keep it in the context of his larger journey?
Yeah, each book has a movement. I mean, the books are very different in that as Evan evolves and becomes more human, the manner and style of book and plot evolves also. And so the earlier books are like, a lot of my influences were like, you know, Le Carré and Reacher, and they were very, well, Le Carré obviously is like unbelievably sophisticated, and Reacher is so smart. Those books are so intelligently written by Lee, but they were, I think the action was a little bit more prominent. You know, Evan in the early books would kill 10 guys in a room, right? It was that way. And as he becomes more human, everyone around him becomes more human, right? And that means even the people he's up against and gonna kill. And it's this process of a deepening of the psychological interaction that he has, of the moral questions that he has. As he starts to have people in his life, the stakes get much more intimate and personal, and that changes the kinds of plots. And so there's definitely a movement where, you know, the books change book to book as he changes and evolves. And that's different than some authors, and it's different from their aims. Like, we talk about Lee a lot because Lee is you know, he's like one of the North Stars for me in the thriller world. But Lee's very clear, like, Reacher books, here's how they work. You know, like, they all have a structure. He changes it, and Reacher has different types of adventures. There's different types of stories. There's different types of events that happen. But he's very clear that each one is sort of a self-contained version that wants to feel in some ways familiar. And the genius of Lee Child is he can do that over and over again, and it feels new and feels like he's constantly expanding the depth. Whereas I'm changing almost the type of thriller that is happening in each one of the books. It's just a different approach to it.
Oh, that's it. Well, now I have to go back and read book one. Just based on what you're saying here, because I know what you mean about Lee. It's, you know, he sort of gets into town, he gets into trouble, he gets out of trouble. It's a similar kind of
setup.
Structure
he's got to
each time, but
sleep with an attractive woman. He's got to get in a fist fight by page 50. Like, there's a set of things that happen, and the genius of Lee is every time it happens,
it feels awesome, and you're like, oh,
and it's new and it's different, and all the depth that he wants of themes are all in there regardless. And so he does it all that way. I just am doing it a bit differently. You know, one of my inspirations, I didn't realize this. I've been going back to read the Robert B. Parker Spencer for Hire novels.
Spencer for Hire. I've never read those.
Oh my God, Robert B. Parker is a master. His writing is so charming. So Robert B. Parker, if you think about him, he's the first person who took the private eye and put him in the real world. Like Spencer cooks. He's like a great chef. His girlfriend is like a Jewish psychoanalyst. They're always having conversations about like, well, why are you so like masculine? What does that mean? Like there's this whole like personal overlay to this. His ability to kind of counsel is he's the bridge movement from the hard-bitten Raymond Chandler, who I love, and Dashiell Hammett, who I love, but slightly less than Chandler because Chandler's Chandler, to put him in the real world and to have this guy evolve. And I've been going back reading them before I realized I was like, oh, that's part of what I'm trying to do in a thriller series, or what I hope to do is to have a thriller character who's evolving and living in the real world with us, and to show how that's something that we can be personally and, you know, involved with in a different way as we toggle back and forth. He's really worth reading, man. He's something.
Yeah. All right. I'll pick that up. Well, we've talked a bit about Lone Wolf sort of throughout, but we'll go specifically to that now. And so listeners and viewers know, Evan is, when he was 12, you mentioned some of this, when he was 12, he gets moved into this orphan program to be a trained assassin. And then I guess the program shuts down. He's Orphan X because he's the 24th person in the program and 24th letter.
Which is really good that he didn't wind up being Orphan W. Would have been a lot harder for branding. So I'm very relieved that worked that way.
Yeah, thank God they chose him exactly then.
Yeah.
And then, as you say, he's sort of vulnerable. I guess, I haven't read book one, but, he even sort of has this, fairly clumsy run-in with an old lady in the book to start it out. So
clumsy's an
he's this sort of vulnerable character. He has relationships that are, have their ups and downs that are sort of an everyman kind of difficult relationship, not an assassin's relationship you don't really read. So you really connect with the character as a person who's then going through these incredible, experiences. But he's an assassin with a moral code. And so, as you say, there's this number you can call when in distress, and he will perhaps come and solve the problems.
That's right.
So what's next for Evan? As you somewhere you've got your split screen of bullet points and manuscript.
Yeah. Well, each book, it's very interesting. One of the things that I do in this series is each book ends, and I hope with a satisfying conclusion to the mission, to the story, to the plot. And then I turn over one more card that's like a cliffhanger for what comes next. And the end of Lone Wolf is the biggest cliffhanger of any book in the series yet. And I don't want to spoil it now for people who might be coming in or reading it, but I always want to end it. I don't want to cliffhang in the sense that things are unresolved from the story, because you need a satisfying book that you can put down and feel like you've got your money's worth. Mm-hmm. But I do turn over a card for the next book, which is going to be far and away his most personal mission when it comes to trying to walk the razor blade tightrope of being the perfection of an assassin with the intimacy of friendship and living in the real world.
Cool. All right, before we get into the lightning round, what is next for you? Because you've got this incredible series going on, Orphan X. You've done some standalones. You've done comic books. You've done screenwriting, which we didn't actually talk about much here. And you've got your other work that you're doing through thriller writers and other work you're doing really all over the place in terms of sort of political depolarization. So what's next for you?
Well, so Orphan X is very much the primary creative focus. It's, novels have always been the spine of my career. I don't know who I am if I'm not writing a novel. I've been super fortunate. I never had to have a real job. I sold my first book pretty much right out of my 1-year stall grad school master's. And I can't believe that I'm writing the 11th book now, because the 10th book's ready to go in a series, and I'm more excited to be writing it than the first one. So that's I'm just delighted. I still can't believe they pay me to do this. It's just it's so great. It's so much fun. I have some screenwriting work that's coming up. I have a project. You know, I had a movie come out a couple years ago. My last movie was called Sweet Girl, starring Jason Momoa. That was on Netflix. I wrote it with a friend, Philip Eisner, who's a wonderful screenwriter. He wrote Event Horizon with Larry Fishburne. We have another movie that we're trying to get up on its feet. I have a film rights happening with Orphan X, which I can't quite talk about in full with proper nouns, but there's a lot happening there that's exciting again.
Oh, that's great. That is. I would love to see that. You'll have to come back when you can talk about it.
I'd love to. I adapted it once already. You know, it sold it a couple times, and I feel like I've steered it in somewhere right.
I read Warner Brothers had the rights or something at one time.
I adapted it for Bradley Cooper, and then I kind of lost him into A Star Is Born, which he was amazing in. But yeah, so I did it Warner's for him, adapted it, and then he I think went a different direction, you know, in terms of where his creative interests were, and brilliantly so. You know, if you see that and you see Maestro. So that'll be fun. You know, I had 2 creator comic books come out. One's called New Think. That's sort of my weird, it's like Twilight Zone meets Black Mirror about technology. And that's a anthology that I created myself for AWA, Artists, Writers, and Artisans. That's a new comic book company that I'm on the creative council of. ITW is great. I mean, our main focus is helping.
By the way, are there term limits? How long are you going to be in there?
Forever. I'm gonna be like Putin.
Especially when you get that other
you
person
talked about absolute power. Yeah. As soon as I bump off Lisa Unger, a little arsenic in her tea. No, I'm going to go in. This is the end of my second term, and there's some discussion if I keep on, if everyone still wants me there. I mean, it's very much a volunteer position. For me, the main focus is just giving back, and so if I can still be useful, I'll stay around and do it, because it's a great org, and we have a chance to do a lot of cool stuff for younger writers. You know, and then I'm digging into some of this recent flare up of, you know, super intense polarization on college campuses and in the world, and trying to figure out how to engage with that and talk about it without falling through the usual booby traps.
That is fraught.
And stepping on the landmines. It's very fraught.
Crazy what's happening. I can't get over it. I mean, this is not really a political show, but man, I can't get over what's happening.
And there's, you know, there's ways to sidestep it. There's ways to explain and diagnose it and go after it, but it takes a good amount of focus. So I'm trying to figure those things out now.
Good luck. I would love to talk with you more about that offline.
Yeah.
All right. So on to the lightning round with the awesome Gregg Hurwitz. First question, favorite book as a kid?
Salem's Lot.
Stephen King.
Yeah.
How old were you when you read that?
Read it under the bed, underneath my bed with a flashlight. Yeah, I was 25 years old. That was amazing. I mean, 4 favorite contemporary books, I would say. Tim O'Brien, The Things They Carried, Red Dragon, Great Gatsby, and The Sound and the Fury.
Those are good picks.
But Salem's Lot, oh man, is that a scary
I remember
book.
reading The Stand and just being so blown away by that and thinking, how on earth did this come from a person's mind? Speaking of AI, couldn't do that. I mean, I was just like, how did he launched this whole thing out of his brain. Book or books you're reading now?
I'm reading René Guénon, who's a French philosopher, and he wrote a book in 1927 called Crisis in the Modern World. That's really interesting. I've been going back, trying to look at this moment in polarization, reading.
Does it hold up? I mean, all parallels to the modern day.
Great. I mean, everyone thinks that the whole, like, the West is crumbling in 1927. So it's very interesting. I'm going back and I reread Carl Jung's Ion. But right now I'm reading John Banville, who's a Irish author, and his new book is called Snow. And it's great. So that's my fiction that I'm into right now.
What's your balance, would you say, in your reading of fiction versus nonfiction?
Nonfiction always feels like work for me.
Yeah.
Except yours, which sounds like it's in that lane, like narrative nonfiction like that. Yeah. Like we were talking about Patricia Cornwell. Yeah. Eric Larson's amazing. And Patricia Cornwell with Jack the Ripper, obviously Truman Capote in Cold Blood.
Yeah. David Grann's doing great stuff now.
Is he?
David Grann, he did Killers of the Flower Moon, and The Wager, and some other good. But yeah, that narrative nonfiction.
Yeah, exactly. I love narrative. Fun. I love stories. I
feel
like
there's
more meaning for me in symbolic narrative than there is in facts.
Yeah. Rudyard Kipling has this great line that if history were told in the form of stories, it would never be forgotten. You know, and that's what some of these writers have tapped into. Least attended book event ever.
Oh God, I did an event when I was starting my career, I'd go anywhere, right? Like you're just scrambling to do anything. And I drove all the way out to like Brea in LA. That was like a 2.5 hour drive through traffic at a Borders, and nobody showed up. And I was sitting there. They had this circle of chairs.
Which book was this?
My second book called Minutes to Burn,
Okay.
which inexplicably is like a Crichton Navy SEAL action thriller with a creature that's evolutionarily, like, it's bananas. I can't believe I wrote it, let alone that it got published. But nonetheless, I went all the way out to Brea, and no one was there. And they keep announcing it over the loudspeakers and waiting for someone to come. And finally,
Just adding to the
the humiliation. Yeah, it was brutal. And so I'm sitting there, and then finally this one like perturbed lady who might have been homeless or just, you know, homeless adjacent kind of came over and sat down. And I said, well, why don't I just, they had the podium. I said, why don't I just sit and talk to you? We can just have a conversation about the book. She said, no, I want the full presentation.
Get back up there.
Yeah. So I went back there on my little podium and gave my presentation. I was like 24, 25. It was awful. And then got in my car, drove all the way back home.
Oh, man.
Starting out, man, I was willing to do anything. I mean, I would drive, go anywhere.
It is so funny. I mean, even, you know, everyone on the show, big stars like you and others, they all have that, you know, they all had their debut book when no one knew who they were. And it's just amazing to hear these stories. And I think for the audience, especially for those in the audience who hope to one day write a book, it's humanizing to hear in the way that you are humanizing Evan. All right, this one you can speak to directly. Batman versus Wolverine. Who wins the fight?
Well, Wolverine, it's very difficult. So I wrote a Wolverine where to kill him, they drop him into a vat of like molten iron or steel, like at the end of the Terminator. Mm-hmm. And then I had this scene where I wanted him crawling out. He has an adamantium skeleton. So this just depends how nerdy you want to go or how many gin and tonics you want to have. The adamantium, right. So he comes out, and I wanted this scene of him like the Terminator with the claws walking out. And there was a raging debate back with like the Wolverine think tank at Marvel where they're like, well, we don't quite know how long it would take for him to reconstitute. And like there was like this raging issue. And so finally I had this big, beautiful 2-page spread, but all it wound up being was the molten footprints out. So we don't even see him. So Wolverine is literally indestructible. So
even if all the flesh is gone.
The flesh is gone. He'll rebuild from adamantium skeleton.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
By the way, I love that there's a Wolverine think tank.
It's amazing. Yeah, when you get into that.
So in this sense, no one can defeat Wolverine. I mean,
Wolverine is fairly undefeatable.
He'll outlast us all.
I mean, maybe, like, I'd have to come up with a whole plan. You'd have to, like, melt him and scatter him to the ends of the fort. Like, there's a whole process. But adamantium is indestructible, you know?
Yeah, okay. All right. Okay, same matchup, Batman v. Wolverine. Who would you rather have a beer with?
Bruce Wayne.
Yeah. More, why? More to say?
Actually, let me revise that. I'd rather have a beer. So Wolverine's, I think he's from like Saskatchewan. He's like he's Canadian, but he's like way more of like a blue collar beer drinker. A cocktail, I'd rather have a martini with Bruce Wayne, but I'd rather have a beer with Wolverine.
Good answer. Reframe the question. The premise was all wrong.
Yeah. That's my Christopher Hitchens approach to this interview.
Favorite thing about life as a writer?
I only spend time focused on things that absolutely interest me.
Wow, that is a precious gift. That's a luxury.
Can you imagine in like the history of humanity to have a job?
You have kids. It can't be only that. I mean, professionally.
Yeah, they don't interest me at all. Yeah, that's true.
All right, last question for Gregg. One piece of advice for the audience.
Audience of writers or just audience in general?
Any way you want it. Do the Hitchens approach. Whatever you want.
Follow that which interests you. Follow that which beckons to you, no matter how insane it might seem. Because that's the thing that calls your attention and calls your interest and calls your focus is the thing that's the most unique to you. And if you follow that, and if you follow it in earnest and you embrace it, that's the pathway to becoming your fullest self.
This applies, by the way, only for like the next 10 years. By that time, we're all in the same algorithm. We're all like following the same algorithm.
That's true. Yeah, we all reach the singularity at the same time.
Yeah. Well, that's great advice. Gregg, what a pleasure. Thanks so much for coming in.
Yeah, this was great. Thank you.